Let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of political analysis. We're looking at Lawson Akinbe's essay, The Alibi of Antiquity. It's a highly critical structural response to President Bola Tinubu's recent statements on hunger and governance in Nigeria. Now, if you follow Nigerian politics, you already know exactly how charged this dialogue can get. So my goal today? Not to take sides, but to just break down exactly how this essay deconstructs the current political narrative.
To keep things totally impartial, we'll be deconstructing the author's argument across 5 core pillars. 1. The president's historical defense. 2. Rising poverty by the numbers. 3. Providence versus policy choice. 4. Validating harsh global narratives. And 5. Taxes, churches, and legitimacy.
So let's jump right into part 1, the president's historical defense.
According to the text, the catalyst for this whole essay was a specific defense the president offered to gathered clergy at the Catholic Bishops' Conference. He essentially stated that hunger existed before he was born and that he has absolutely no control over the country's population growth. He then took it a step further, urging the bishops to let their churches, quote, give you hope. Now, the essay argues that sure, these statements are historically factual. Hunger did exist before he was born. But the underlying rhetorical intent of that statement, that is what really demands our attention.
The author, Alibi, defines this specific framing not as just historical background, but as a political alibi. And the essay makes a brilliant comparison here. It likens his rhetoric to a defendant standing in court telling the judge that he shouldn't have to account for a burglary simply because crime existed before he was born. I mean, think about how often we see this tactic in modern politics, right? Stretching the doctrine of necessity to cover basic, everyday governance, like a nation's grocery bill.
Moving on to Part 2, Rising Poverty by the Numbers.
To really ground this critique, the essay cites figures raised by political critics like Peter Obi. The text notes that acute food insecurity in the country has roughly doubled since 2023. We are now talking about a staggering 35 million people being impacted. This serves as a stark reminder that, regardless of what was inherited 3 years into an administration, the current realities on the ground are shifting, and they are shifting rapidly.
And this trajectory brutally illustrates the author's point. Looking at World Bank data cited in the text, extreme poverty has climbed significantly, going from around 115 million people at the time of the handover to an estimated 140 to 141 million people today. The essay points out a harsh reality here. Numbers are notoriously indifferent to the doctrine of inherited liability. They literally don't care whose watch they fall on. They only reflect the current state of affairs.
Which brings us to Part 3, Providence versus policy choice. The author draws a super sharp contrast here. On one hand, you have a framing that treats population growth as a natural fact, basically an uncontrollable act of God, kind of like rainfall. On the other hand, the global alternative treats population as a completely governable variable. The essay argues that narrating population growth as an act of providence coincidentally ensures that no minister actually has to answer for it. But treating it like the weather completely ignores successful global precedents.
To prove this isn't just theoretical, the essay points directly to Singapore, because, Singapore didn't just get lucky with its demographics. According to the text, they used 3 very specific policy steps to govern their population: female secondary education, contraceptive access, and urbanization. By actively choosing policy over just shrugging at providence, Singapore successfully raised its GDP per capita from parity with 1965 Mexico all the way to parity with 1990s Germany, and they did it all within a single working lifetime. It's a massive historical counterweight to the act of God argument.
Okay, let's look at Part 4, Validating Harsh Global Narratives.
Akinbe argues that when a head of state declares core functions like feeding its people impossible, it inadvertently hands a massive victory to harsh Western narratives. Just look at the restricted policies recently built by the Trump administration. South Africa barred from the 2026 G20, new tariffs layered onto 7 different African economies, gutted aid programs, and refugee admissions functionally closed. The essay argues these barriers weren't built out of pity, but from a settled, highly cynical premise that the continent simply manages itself badly.
So this domestic communication strategy inadvertently lends a lot of credibility to crude global framing. The text actually references Emmanuel Macron's infamous past remarks about African birth rates. And while those remarks were rightly condemned at the time, Alibi argues that when a domestic president confirms on video that hunger is just an inherited reality and population is totally uncontrollable, well, it hands a gift-wrapped argument to foreign leaders who are already inclined to write the continent off. It literally transforms a domestic communications error into a major diplomatic liability.
Finally, we arrive at Part 5, Taxes, Churches, and Legitimacy.
The absolutely crucial point the author makes here is borrowed from a sharp rebuke by the Nigerian Democratic Congress. It boils down to some pretty basic constitutional logic. The state collects taxes while the church collects offerings. Therefore, citizens paying their taxes are perfectly entitled to expect the state, not the sacristy, to answer for their dinner. The fiscal relationship between a citizen and their government simply does not run through the offering plate.
The essay drives this point home with a brilliant, biting hypothetical. Antiquity suggests that if the president truly wishes to delegate the feeding of the nation to religious institutions, that hey, perhaps he should delegate the collection of value-added tax to the churches as well. You can imagine how quickly that arrangement would get reconsidered, right? It's a humorous but incredibly cutting way to highlight the absurdity of outsourcing core government responsibility.
Look, hunger has been a part of Nigerian life for decades, a point even critics have conceded. But that, the essay argues, was never actually the real issue. The true issue is legitimacy. We'll leave you with this final, highly provocative question drawn directly from the text's conclusion. Does a government's entire claim to legitimacy rest on being able to say that things are just less bad on its watch than the watch before? And can that claim ever truly be sustained by pointing at the horizon and declaring the weather someone else's problem? It challenges us all to rethink the true measure of political accountability. Thanks for walking through this explainer with me. Keep asking questions.